Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Greetings all. Well, Tantra Illuminated podcast has now reached its 40th episode, and we're now on a bi-weekly schedule, as you may have noticed, and will continue to be for some time to come. And we have many more great episodes coming up for you. For this week's episode, we dive deep into the archives and release an interview conducted 8 years ago. We hope to eventually have all the interviews I've ever done here on Tantra Illuminated podcast, so they're all in one place. And here I'm being interviewed by Jacob Kyle for his podcast called Chitheads. This title might be easily misunderstood. In Sanskrit, the word chit means awareness. So he went with an amusing pun for the title of his podcast, which is still going strong today and has had many wonderful guests. I invite you to check it out. And when Jacob interviewed me 8 years ago, the podcast had just begun at that time. So we were both younger, perhaps not without wisdom, I hope. So I'll read a little bit from Jacob's bio. He is a yoga and meditation teacher, writer, philosophy educator, and the founder for Embodied Philosophy, an online educational platform for wisdom studies and contemplative practices. Jacob holds 3 master's degrees, including an MPhil in Sanskrit and Indian philosophy from the University of Oxford. He is a practitioner as well as a scholar and has been practicing under the great Paul Muller-Ortega since 2015. And in 2020, Paul initiated Jacob as an acharya or authorized teacher of Nilakantha meditation. And Jacob continues to dedicate his life to studying deeply the texts and traditions of Shakta Shaiva Darshana, as well as making available through the Embodied Philosophy platform transformative wisdom teachings, practices, and perspectives. And I myself have a course on his platform called Chakras Illuminated, which is a very popular and well-loved course, I'm told. So Jacob is in some ways a competitor, but he's also a friend, and I'm glad to call him a friend. He's a great guy. So please enjoy this interview from 2016.
My guest today is Christopher Wallace. Christopher, also known as Harish, was introduced to Indian spirituality at the age of 7 and initiated into the practice of yogic meditation at 16. His degrees include a BA in Religion and Classics from the University of Rochester, an MA in Sanskrit from UC Berkeley, an MPhil in Classical Indian Religions from Oxford, and a PhD on the traditions of Shaiva Tantra from Berkeley. He received traditional education at yoga ashrams in upstate New York and India in meditation, kirtan, mantra science, asana, karma yoga, and more. He currently teaches meditation, yoga darshana or philosophy, tantric philosophy, Sanskrit, mantra science, and offers spiritual counseling. His teachers, mentors, and gurus in chronological order include Guru Mai Chidvilasananda, Paul Muller-Ortega, Alexis Sanderson, Marshall Rosenberg, Somadeva Vasudeva, Dharma Bodhi Sarasvati, and Adyashanti. Harish is the author of Tantra Illuminated, The Philosophy, History, and Practice of a Timeless Tradition. So with that, hello, Christopher. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
So it's really exciting opportunity to interview you because I have to say, reading your book, Tantra Illuminated, was quite a game changer for me. I had felt called kind of intuitively to this tradition, but I didn't have a resource to really investigate and be introduced to the whole scale and scope of the tradition, which you do such an excellent job exploring in that book. So I wanted to just start off talking a little bit about that and maybe what your intention was behind writing Tantra Illuminated and anything else you might want to share about that project.
Yeah, well, I wrote the book initially by invitation. So it just so happened that the now infamous John Friend of Anusara Yoga was a friend of mine because we had both, seriously studied at Guru Mai's ashram in the Catskills, throughout the 90s. And I was quite young then, but I got to know him before he started Anusara. And then, once Anusara was in full swing about 6 years ago, before that whole scandal, he, asked me to write an overview of the Tantric tradition for Anusara Press. And, it actually was a great invitation because I was given full creative freedom. I was able to dictate the design of the book. He put up all the money, I got pretty much exactly the design I wanted. That first edition certainly had its share of typos, but the design was beautiful and was definitely what I wanted. And the lack of editorial interference was wonderful. I could just write the book I wanted to write, which was this, 400 plus page overview of the original tantric tradition that, we didn't have there. This is the only book of its kind in the sense that there are many books on tantra, but there's no other book that gives an overview of the whole tradition in terms of its philosophy, its history, and its practice, and which is non-sectarian. The book focuses on Shaiva Tantra or Shiva Shakti Tantra as opposed to Buddhist Tantra. However, within that rubric, it's non-sectarian. That is to say, it's not prejudiced towards any specific lineage or lineage grouping or sectarian view, of which there are many.
Right.
So it is this kind of broad overview, and it filled a niche, that needed to be filled, and that's why I think it continues to sell purely by word of mouth. I think we're well over 10,000 copies now. It's hard to keep track.
Wow.
But that's purely by word of mouth because it does fill a niche.
Yeah.
And so it's been great to get feedback. I constantly get feedback from people who say, finally, I can understand what the heck is going on, because all these little pieces of tantric philosophy and practice that people get from different teachers, the book fits them into an overarching, coherent context. And for people who want that, that is extremely satisfying. And I think you might have been one of those people.
Yes. Well, and part of the niche that I feel like it's speaking to is what you mentioned at the beginning of the book, which is the appeal to the scholar-practitioner, which it seems to me that, there are a lot of books on Tantra, and a lot of them are based on kind of a fluffy distillation of the philosophy or confusion between traditions, or just not an interest in being historically accurate. So I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit about this split generally between the scholar and the practitioner, and why texts like this that you're offering are so important to kind of begin to transcend that divide.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That's a super important question, because we do have a substantial divide. And if I can describe it briefly, it's simply that on one side, we have very rigorous scholarship happening on tantric philosophy and practice amongst Sanskrit scholars in North America and Europe and worldwide. And these scholars have virtually no communication with the practitioner community, which by and large is extremely confused about historical issues and indeed even philosophical issues. The primary confusion philosophically being, as I said, this kind of inability to distinguish between one's idiosyncratic individual teacher's perspective or individual lineage's perspective against the overarching mainstream view of the tradition. So we do have this, essentially, if we can just simplify it down to a very simple statement, it would be hyper-intellectual scholars who are rarely practitioners, but who understand the tradition well. And on the other hand, practitioners who rarely understand much about the tradition or are educated in anything outside their own lineage. And the practitioners tend to speak in language that's very vague or fuzzy or ambiguous or mystical or airy-fairy. And that's not satisfying to people who want really grounded information. But neither is the scholarship satisfying to people who want a spiritual application of these teachings, not just an intellectual one. So this all leads to the obvious conclusion that the role of the scholar practitioner in bridging these worlds is important, and we have very, very few of them. We need more scholar practitioners. We have a dozen or so prominent ones that are actively working today. In the last generation, we had a great example in Georg Feuerstein.
Yeah.
And, we now know made many mistakes, but he was a trailblazer and he was a scholar practitioner. And his book on Tantra is really the only one that's comparable to mine. The difference being that he covered the elements of classical Tantra that were absorbed into mainstream Hinduism, whereas my book focuses more on the unique doctrines of classical Tantra that in many ways are different from mainstream Hinduism. But his book is also to be recommended, and now we have more scholar practitioners, and we need still more. But yes. The conversation is opening up, and we have online journals now like Sutra Journal, which are actually publishing both respected scholars and practitioners side by side, and that really is a great thing. So now people cannot. Teachers cannot get away with not doing their homework and saying, giving undue authority to unexamined pronouncements,
Yeah. I've seen Sutra Journal, and I think it's a fantastic resource. And as you say, there does seem to be, the tide seems to be changing somewhat in that the research is circulating, I think, a little bit better than perhaps it has been. So that's good news, I suppose. So now I want to talk a little bit about your story and kind of what I know that you started practicing at a very young age. So I'd love to kind of hear the arc of the story of your practice and how you encountered this philosophy and this practice and sort of the ups and downs perhaps along the way, if you want to share any of those.
Sure. With the caveat that, autobiography is not very interesting to me as a genre. I like telling specific stories and sharing specific experiences, but the kind of arc of autobiography is relatively meaningless to me because I think it's more or less impossible to kind of tell a story of a life in a way that's non-reductionistic. And so, but having issued that caveat, I'll just say, my parents got into traditional forms of Indian meditation when I was young, and I was exposed to, things like Sanskrit chanting and mantras from the age of about 7. And in fact, the first time I heard the mantra Om Namah Shivaya as a kid, I spontaneously closed my eyes and had a vision, the only vision I've ever had in my life. Wow. At 7 years old, I had this vision of a being, a very beautiful kind of wise being made entirely of blue light. So this guru type being, though I didn't even know the word guru at the time, but this guru type being appearing in a light body made entirely of kind of iridescent, shimmering blue light as soon as I heard the mantra for the first time. And imagine then the impression it made on me years later as a teenager when I discovered that having a vision of a guru or a wise person in a blue light body is a classical experience, recorded in published sources. So that was amazing, right? Yeah. Because there was no context for that. I was 7. I was certainly not reading any spiritual books, and my parents had literally just discovered this and brought home this mantra tape from the meditation center that they had first attended the previous week. So, there's no context at all. And so this vision, in retrospect, taught me a lot about the nature of mystical experience because, the vision that I had was unique to me, but at the same time it was of a kind that other people have had in the specific tradition that I ended up studying. So I can't explain that logically, but it seems significant. Then of course I had a teenage rebellion period where I'm like, this is weird, and my dad moved on to other things spiritually, and my mom stuck with traditional Hindu meditation, and I thought, that's not really for me. And then at 16, I met Guru Mai Chidvilasananda for the first time in person, and that was a life-changing experience for me, and kind of everything flowed from there. I had my own experience of this spiritual path, and came to it on my own terms. And by the way, I should just mention for your listeners, the word chit, consciousness or awareness, that you have in your Chitheads, that's actually the same word as chid in Chidvilasananda. My first guru's name means the bliss of the play of consciousness. And of course, it's the same word again in Satchidananda, being consciousness and bliss, because Sanskrit words change their form depending on the words they're adjacent to. So chit and chid are the same word. Anyway, so that's a Sanskrit geek note. Of course, I ended up
Thank you for that.
Ended up becoming a Sanskrit. I mean, long story short, I got into meditation. I kept going to the meditation center religiously, even in those turbulent teen years of discovering sex and drugs and rock and roll, all of which interested me. Yes. And the thing is, though, I kept a lifeline that I think was a saving grace in the end to the meditation practice. And once I got kind of more and more into it in my early 20s, I wanted to go deeper. And the ashram, Guru Mai's ashram was great, but it didn't offer advanced studies. It didn't really even offer intermediate studies. They needed to appeal to a wider base of relatively uneducated yogis, partially to fund the massive place that they had, that they've since downsized, and so they didn't have to have that huge scene. But anyway, I at the time, this was like 1997, I decided to study deeper, and I was delighted to meet, Paul Muller, who had just gotten a professorship at the University of Rochester. And so I went there as an undergrad, age 24. I had never gone to college because I didn't know what I wanted to study and why do it otherwise, So I went. I was a freshman at age 24.
Oh, you didn't go to your first year in college? You were 24 years old?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
Yep. Yeah, because I didn't believe in going to college without knowing why you wanted to be there, And it ended up being a very wise thing because with focus and dedication, knowing what I wanted to do, I got almost straight A's for 4 years, which I never would have done if I'd gone to college at 18 or 19 years old.
Right.
So if any parents are out there hearing this, take note. Pressuring your kid to go to college before they're ready, it hurts everyone, I think. But anyway, so I did end up doing really, really well. I studied with Douglas Brooks and Paul Muller, and I ended up gravitating much more to Paul, his teaching style, and the content of his teaching, who I think is simply a brilliant scholar, and as well as a practitioner, a very, very dedicated practitioner. And he, checking out his published articles and his teaching, I recommend either of those. So then I wanted to go even deeper, because what I discovered when I got into Tantra and Shaivism, the religion of Shiva Shakti, and specifically Tantric Shaivism, I discovered a spiritual tradition that seemed to go infinitely deep. The richness of the teachings and the subtlety and sophistication of the spiritual wisdom was just what I really wanted, because I was so turned off by that time, 2001 now, that so turned off by the watered down or made ready for prime time or bastardized versions of these beautiful spiritual teachings. And so I discovered to my delight that there really was a tradition that took it as deep as you could possibly want to go. And it wasn't airy-fairy, in the sense that there was real substance behind the teachings, that if you inquired, it was a tradition that encouraged questioning. And when you did inquire, there was more there to be found. It wasn't just, a smoke screen. And so that was wonderful to discover. And I decided to, learn Sanskrit. And long story short, I don't however much I can make it short, it's hard. But, I learned Sanskrit and was able to study at Oxford with the greatest living scholar of Tantra. He's a scholar of all forms of Tantra, but he specialized in Tantric Shaivism, because that is the tradition that originated Tantric philosophy and practice. And, finally, I did end up getting my PhD, but I realized, wow, I don't want to just be a scholar. I want to teach practitioners, because in the scholarly avenue, there's just infinite work to be done, and it can get very, very, very pedantic.
Yeah.
And, so I wanted to bring these teachings to people who were thirsting for them, and who didn't have that much access to well-grounded information. So that's how Tantra Illuminated came about, to come full circle, that I wanted to write something anyone can read without a degree in the subject, and yet was grounded in the incredible scholarly work of the past 30 or 40 years, which most of the public doesn't have access to. It's extremely difficult to read if you don't already have a degree in the subject.
Right.
That scholarship, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that story of your, deep and long investigation into this tradition. So now I want to go into what Tantra is, for those out there who don't really understand so much about the tradition, or they may have a very, we have a kind of colloquial or folk understanding of what Tantra means that is very much at odds, or, somewhat at odds with the work that you're doing. So I would love for you to kind of describe the Tantric tradition and how it's been misunderstood.
Sure, and that's, of course, something hard to put into a few words, and unlike my autobiography, I won't even try to put it into a few words, but what I will say is, just to talk about the word itself, there's a modern spiritual teacher, Byron Katie, and she calls her teaching the work.
Yeah.
And in the same way, Tantra itself means the system. Because Tantra means a system of practice, or a doctrine, or a matrix of ideas, or a scripture teaching a specific system of practice. So to refer to Tantra as an unmodified noun, is like the system, this amazing coherent system of spiritual practice that arose 1500 years ago. Well, maybe earlier, but the first documented evidence is 1500 years ago, and which was so successful that it did something that we've basically never seen in the history of Asia, which is it swept through a huge geographical area in a matter of a couple of centuries. Here's a little piece of trivia which shows how rapid its spread was, because we have very detailed records of Chinese pilgrims who wrote travelogues about India in the 6th and 7th centuries, and one of these pilgrims traveled all over India, doesn't mention Tantra, right? And then just 2 generations later, we have the travelogue of another Chinese pilgrim who traveled all over India, and he's talking about Tantra a lot. And Tantra is all the rage, and he finds it in almost every single Buddhist establishment that he visits. And so in 2 generations or less, all of Buddhism in India became Tantricized. So Tantra then is a system of spiritual practice, a way of doing spirituality. It's a way of doing religion, if you prefer. So that's why we can speak of non-tantric Buddhism and tantric Buddhism, as well as non-tantric Vaishnavism, the religion of Vishnu, and tantric Vaishnavism, which barely survives anymore, but it used to be there, and tantric Shaivism, and so on. And Tibetan Buddhism, then, is simply tantric Buddhism. It's just that nobody is familiar with a non-Tibetan form of tantric Buddhism because it was wiped out in India by the Muslim invasions, and tantric Buddhism survived pretty much only in Tibet and parts of China, and it didn't survive the communist revolution in China. So today, tantric Buddhism really survives only in Tibet, but it used to be much more widespread, just like tantric Shaivism used to be spread throughout Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and we see the remnants of it today in Bali. But tantric Shaivism used to flourish in Java, in Indonesia, again wiped out by Muslim invasions, and used to flourish all over India, and then was absorbed into the Hindu mainstream, and many of the unique doctrines and practices were almost completely lost and passed down only by in specific lineages. And some of them did survive to the present day. So it's not an artificial revival to get into classical Tantra. It did survive. It passed through the eye of a historical needle, as it were. It almost didn't survive, but it did. And now it's making a comeback, Yeah. So again, in the form of tantric Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, worldwide, enjoying a renaissance. And of course, that is a very institutionalized form of Tantra, and it's quite dogmatic compared to Shaiva Tantra, which is much more yogic, much more grassroots, much more organic and fluid in its nature. So those people who are not drawn to institutions enjoy the teachings and practices of Shaiva Tantra even more than Buddhist Tantra. So I think that's why we're seeing this surge of interest over the past generation, especially of interest in Shaiva Tantra, even if people don't even know the name of it. When they encounter the teachings, when they hear about the teachings from any kind of well-grounded source, people get very excited. I've seen amazing reactions to these teachings literally all over the world. I've taught in South America, Mexico, North America, Europe, India, all over the place. And everywhere people give a very, very strong positive response to non-dual Shaiva Tantric teachings. So
how did the word Tantra become so associated in the West with a form of sex, and then also in parts of India with black magic? How did that kind of transformation of meaning?
Well, that is a long story as well, and I just want to refer the listener to another podcast if I can, because I talk at length about this question there, and I don't have time to do so here. So Ashton Sabo's podcast, gosh, what's it called? Shivani or Shivana or something. Anyway, maybe we can provide a link to that.
Sure. I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, and so that's an hour-long discourse on this very topic.
Okay.
Essentially, it's a misunderstanding, meaning, people that modern Western or American neo-tantra or sexual tantra has been around for 100 years, and it originated purely by hearsay, meaning the people who originated this completely Western sexual tantra teaching, they just heard about, they didn't have access to primary sources. They just heard about the idea of a sexual ritual in a yogic context in ancient India, and they got excited by that idea, and they tried to create it. They essentially invented it on the basis of hearsay. Which is not to say it's invalid, right? It's now evolved for 100 years in the West, and if you go to a neo-tantra teacher, a sexual tantra teacher, they had their teacher who had their teacher who had their teacher, and it goes back probably 100 years. So I'm not invalidating it. I'm just saying there's no direct connection to the original tradition, and indeed, in original tantra, we find zero sexual techniques being taught. We do find some sexual meditations, but no techniques for enhancing or maximizing sexual pleasure, because that was never a part of original tantra. Only modern neo-tantra or sexual tantra, whatever you want to call it. So the two words to me are simply homonyms. They happen to sound the same, and they're not the same word. English tantra and Sanskrit tantra, is one way to distinguish. So how did the misunderstanding come about? That's way too complicated to get into, but Robert Love has written on the subject very cogently. Hugh Urban has written on the subject very cogently as well. I recommend those for those who are interested. And I've mentioned elsewhere that Westerners saw these images of deities copulating, and those are real tantric images, these images of deities copulating, and they thought, this is a religion of sex, where in fact the images of deities copulating, like Shiva and Shakti, or Buddhist deities, same thing. These images are actually metaphorical. When Shiva and Shakti are depicted making love, that's supposed to communicate to the viewer the intimate interconnection of awareness and energy. Shiva is pure awareness, or silent, still, spacious awareness, and Shakti is flowing patterns of energy. And the image in one go manages to encapsulate and communicate the whole goal of the path, which is to bring transcendental pure awareness and the flowing energy patterns of human life into perfect harmony. So the image communicates that better than any other image could, because making love is blissful. Making love is union when it's done right. Okay, it's a merging, it's a oneness, right? But what's being depicted is the oneness of awareness and energy, of the transcendent and the immanent. And that is the whole goal of the tantric path. That's what that image is communicating. It's not telling you, getting it on is the path to liberation. That's not what it's communicating. Of course, the tradition had nothing against sexuality. It was sex positive in that sense, but it wasn't putting sexuality forward as a means to liberation either.
Okay, so what you're saying here, we're already kind of transitioning into the conversation about non-dualism. So now I guess I just want to bring that word into the conversation, and maybe have you're already doing it, but maybe have you elaborate on what non-dual tantra means, what it looks like, and how it might be contrasted to a dualistic understanding spiritually.
Yeah. So, the phrase, the word non-dualism is almost synonymous with monism, but not quite. Monism means there's only one thing in all of existence. And that is what the teachings tell us, but they prefer the term non-dualism, which translates the Sanskrit advaita or advaya, because non-dualism specifically connotes as a term that there appear to be two things that are in fact really one. Yeah. And that's what they did want to emphasize, that there is a two-ness to reality, or a threeness, depending on how you look at it, but a fundamental two-ness, and that is consciousness and energy, where matter is included within energy, and that these two are in fact one, and that to discover that truth experientially is the goal of the path. We find this teaching in multiple branches of the tradition, expressed patterned flows of energy. So the tradition is saying, look, this absolute silent, still void that you encounter in deep meditation is actually the direct source of every form. And the formless void embodies itself as form. And that, in other words, there's no ultimate division between the transcendent and the immanent. Now, this can sound like an esoteric mystical doctrine, but it's actually has great practical implications. Number one being that it erases the boundary, the human-made boundary between the spiritual life and the worldly or mundane life. There is nothing unspiritual in this view. That is to say, everything is an expression of spirit. Now, having said that, of course, there is behavior and conduct that doesn't lead to realization of the truth, and therefore is unspiritual in that sense, right? But in this deeper sense of everything is an expression of spirit, everything is an expression of God, if you prefer that term, or of Buddha nature, or of infinite consciousness. It's like fill in the blank in terms of that, what term you're using, because no term can actually capture it. But the implication of the teaching is to realize the divine, or unconditioned Buddha nature, if you're a Buddhist, in the everyday life, in the details of everyday life, in your relationships, in your job, in the simplest everyday actions express the purity and the joy of innate consciousness, divine consciousness itself. So it's hard to put that, in a few words effectively. But to sum up, the non-dual teaching is not only is everything interconnected, there is a seamless unity. There are no actual divisions in reality, and everything is a seamless unity of flowing energy and awareness, and all the kind of divisions we create within ourselves and between each other are artificial. And when we dissolve those divisions and experience seamless unity, it leads to a practical outcome, which is natural compassion, love, and respect for all beings, for nature, for the environment. It creates a different paradigm to live in when you actually experience seamless unity. It's different from just believing in unity. Believing in unity doesn't put you in the different paradigm. You must be experiencing it, and then you automatically are in this different paradigm where your behavior reflects your experience, and your behavior, without any effort whatsoever, is beneficial to all beings. That's the tantric vision, kind of in a nutshell. And I could say more and come at it from different angles, but...
So, yeah, I want to ask a question based on kind of, I'm imagining sort of someone who is encountering what you're saying, what you said about all expressions of life being divine, and somebody maybe with a superficial understanding who's also a drug addict would say, Okay, well, since, this implies that there's no hierarchy of value because everything is equally divine, what is the teaching that then would encourage someone who is, who's addicted to drugs, or who is otherwise in a kind of very limited experiential place? How would they, because it seems like they could interpret the teachings as everything is divine and then see like, well, this is equally divine as anything else. So what internally to the tradition would aid someone to, rise out of this kind of form of suffering?
Well, I think that's a great question. And, if an alcoholic or a heroin addict says, hey, alcohol or heroin is divine too, so who are you to judge me? From the tradition's point of view, they actually have a point that we don't have the basis on which to make a moral judgment about that.
Yeah.
And the teaching that offers them a hand out of that situation if they want it is precisely not there's something wrong with what they're doing or that it's not divine. It's that the course of action they're engaged in doesn't lead to experiential realization of divinity in all things. Even though divinity is in all things, that doesn't mean you're experiencing it, So if the person who's an addict decides they want to have that experience, if they decide they want to be free of dependence on a substance and experience the divine equally in all things without recourse to any substance, then the tradition says, hey, we've got tools to help you with that, and we've got a hand to lift you out of that quicksand. But if you want to go down that road, and if you want to destroy your body with those substances, fine.
Go right ahead.
Like, who are we to say that that's wrong?
Right.
Who are we to say that you're a bad person for doing that? There is no moral high ground in that sense in the tradition. And yet there's a profound compassion and a willingness to help as soon as the person says, I want to make a change. I want to do something different. This isn't actually leading me where I want to go. So I think it is possible to actually relinquish judgment of other people for their actions, and yet at the same time acknowledge that those actions may not lead them to realization of the truth or to real fulfillment. And that's okay. It's okay that, not everyone is interested in those questions, at least in this lifetime.
Okay. So how does, just going back to the subject of non-dualism, how does not the non-dualism of Shaivism differ from the non-dualism of Vedanta?
So you, as an interviewer, have an incredible skill in asking the questions that to answer
require
fully,
a long answer.
Each question, I just want the listeners to know, each question would require a full hour, really, to do justice to. But the short answer is this: it's a very significant difference, and people with a superficial understanding of Indian philosophy or yoga like to say, "Oh, they're all saying the same thing. They're all saying oneness. We're all one." Well, first of all, that's not true. There's yogic philosophies that posit two-ness, that as absolute, spirit versus matter, and never the twain should meet. But yes, Vedanta and Tantra are both saying oneness, but in a very different way. Why? Two things. One is that Vedanta is an illusionist doctrine primarily, meaning to say oneness is real and diversity is an illusion. Now, that's the fundamental stance of earlier Vedanta, meaning pre-20th century Vedanta, because 20th century and 21st century Vedanta is mixed up with everything else.
Right.
But Vedanta, properly speaking, says diversity is an illusion. I think that's a very problematic stance, especially as our discourse has gotten very sophisticated in how not honoring diversity in our society, whether sexual or racial or any other kind of diversity, I should say ethnic instead of racial, but not honoring diversity is a form of oppression, becomes a form of oppression. And Tantra then is a better philosophy for our time, practically speaking, because it says diversity is real and it's beautiful. One consciousness becomes all these different forms with different desires, and that's all beautiful. Diversity is not an illusion. This one divine consciousness really does become these different forms, even though it retains its essential essence. Whereas Vedanta says, no, transformation is not real. That's illusory. Nothing has ever really happened. All action is an illusion. And so the practical implications are big, because as a Tantrika, you don't have to renounce the world. As a Vedantin, as a strict Vedantin, you need to renounce the world, because it's what deludes you, because the world, oneness is real, and this apparent diversity, which brings you into, from the Vedantic point of view, is problematic. Now, the other main point is that Tantra criticizes Vedanta by saying they have no Shakti, meaning the vision of consciousness in Vedanta is static and unchanging. That's why they have to assert that diversity is an illusion. Whereas in Tantra, consciousness, divine consciousness, the ground of being, is dynamic and self-transforming. So dynamism translates the word Shakti. So essentially it's radically different views, because Tantra is saying, the divine is inherently dynamic. Desire and action are inherent to the divine itself. Whereas Vedanta is saying, no, desire and action are part of the realm of illusion. The divine is an absolute unchanging reality. Now, this is a stark contrast then, and it's, there's a much more subtle way to talk about these things, but the contrast is real. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, it would have to be a longer answer to explain why the Vedantins arrived at that view and why it made sense within their context, and then why and how the Tantrikas criticized them. And, were eventually successful, because in modern Vedanta, there is a tantric spin that's given. A modern Vedanta teacher usually has a tantric spin to their teaching. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, Tantra won that particular philosophical debate about the nature of reality.
Well, for giving you questions that require a lot of a long answer, you're doing a very good job at answering them succinctly. So thank you. One of the things that just kind of came to me as you were mentioning this, and what I've thought about before, is how interesting it is that, and I know this is changing, but generally within the context of teacher trainings or study of yoga philosophy in general, the Upanishads and the Vedanta are studied very closely, but really it is the non-dualism of Shaivism that seems much more appropriate to a Hatha yoga-centered yoga practice, since it's not a renunciant thing. It's you're looking to kind of deepen and unite with your body in some way. It just seems like it's more conducive. And is it also true, from what I understand, that Hatha emerged from the traditions of Shaivism as well?
Yes. I mean, there's two important things that are operative here, and I think this is so important for modern yogis to be thinking about. So first of all, there's a conflation of yoga with Hinduism that happens. And by that I mean that Vedanta is not yogic originally. Modern Vedanta is taught in conjunction with yoga, but for most of its history, Vedanta was not yogic, meaning no psychophysical practices were approved as a part of it. It was purely an intellectual contemplative philosophy that sought experiential realization, but purely through contemplation, not through any psychophysical practices of yoga whatsoever. So that's important to realize, that when you're teaching Vedanta in a history of yoga, that's because you're confusing yoga with Hinduism.
Yeah.
And if you teach yoga strictly speaking, Vedanta doesn't really have much of a place. the Upanishads do, because the Upanishads are actually a wonderful mixed bag of teachings, including yogic teachings. They just happen to get co-opted, as it were, or taken over by Vedantic teachers, and everything in the Upanishads was explained Vedantically, but the original texts themselves include all kinds of teachings, including yogic ones. So just to mention that, the Upanishads do have a place in a history of yoga, and Vedanta deserves, as far as I'm concerned, a passing mention in a history of yoga.
Yeah.
And so that's important. And number two issue in these yoga teacher trainings, again, is the fact that traditions that emphasize renunciation are being taught to people with no intent of renouncing.
Right.
And I think that is philosophically and spiritually incoherent.
Yeah.
That's why once it becomes better known, I suppose, tantric philosophy will no doubt take over, because it is the philosophy articulated specifically for non-renunciates. And I think also having renunciate swamis teaching householders, meaning non-renunciates, is likewise problematic. The tradition itself says people who have renounced sexuality and career and family should not be teaching those who have not renounced those things. And that's exactly what we have in modern India, is renunciate swamis for the last 100 plus years, renunciate swamis teaching non-renunciates. From a tantric point of view, it's a big problem. And we need more and more qualified teachers who haven't renounced and who are teaching philosophies that align with the values of their students, rather than imposing, or without even meaning to, often imposing quasi-renunciate values. And that's why we still have shame about sexuality in our yoga communities. We still have shame about making money and things like that. And, even though we like to act as if we don't have those things. It's undercurrents of Puritanism that come from these renunciate traditions.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, what I find as well is, there's this confusion between trying to teach renunciant traditions and teachings, but also then trying to change, to confuse kind of what they were originally intending with a non-renunciant practice. So trying to kind of contort the teachings to fit the modern milieu in a sense, which is what I see a lot of times happening in the distillation of some of these philosophies, is like, okay, we're just going to pass over that, very obviously glaring renunciant teaching, and we're going to try to, retranslate and appropriate in our own kind of way that works for us these other teachings, which I think we'll get a little bit more into in a moment when we talk about appropriating certain texts, which we'll talk about when we talk about your Roche article. But before we get to that, I would love to, I was thinking about when I went to one of your teachings recently in Brooklyn, to one of your talks, you talk about, which I thought was so interesting and important, this idea of enlightenment. And we often, the goal of the tradition is often translated as enlightenment, but you talk about historically why that might be problematic, and you offer an alternative translation, which I'll let you offer. So I was hoping you could maybe expand upon that discussion and why translating the goal of practice as enlightenment might be something to avoid.
Yeah. Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Sanskrit term bodha or bodhi has been translated as enlightenment for 200 years now. And it's problematic because it conflates these distinctly Eastern spiritual ideas with Western concepts of enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement in European philosophy, of course, and they're not the same at all. And confusing them is problematic. But more importantly, when people hear the term enlightenment, it suggests to them that this spiritual goal or spiritual realization necessarily includes a kind of download of wisdom. And it doesn't necessarily include that. And indeed, someone can have a true spiritual awakening and yet still need to do the integration work. Yeah. So, in the tradition, we understand that there's these two terms that are operative: awakening and liberation. So you can awaken to the truth of your own being, but still not be liberated from your psychological baggage and samskaras, because those operate on sort of two different levels. Because the truth, the divine core of your being, is free of all your psychological baggage, but when you go to talk and interact with other human beings, you're using your mind and your body, and that's where the psychological baggage is. So the tantric tradition articulates, hey, unless you're just going to sit in a cave and meditate on your own soul, you have to do integration work. And the integration work doesn't come automatically as part and parcel of awakening or so-called enlightenment. You have to be willing to do it. And it's sometimes painful and it's sometimes joyful to integrate your realization, your awakening, into all the areas of your life. And I wrote a blog about that on my website, which people should read if they're interested in this topic. But the key is that there is a goal to spiritual practice. It is attainable. When we phrase it as enlightenment, it sounds far distant. It sounds esoteric, and most people aren't interested. But if we phrase the same goal as awakening to your true nature, everyone gets more interested. But that is the correct translation. That's what the term means. It's about awakening to your true nature. However that's defined, the Buddhists define it as a kind of radiant nothingness, and the Shaivas prefer to define it as pure consciousness or presence. But they're really talking about the same thing, I'm convinced. And so awakening to your true nature is what it's really all about. But then comes the further work of integrating that self-realization, where self doesn't constitute a static entity necessarily. Self just refers to what you really are. So the realization of your true nature then needs to be integrated into all the levels of your being. And for most people, that doesn't proceed automatically. And they have to ask themselves the question, hey, what would my relationships look like if I allowed what I have realized deep down inside to permeate my conduct? And that is a crucial question. And without it, people become spiritual bypassers, where they have awakened to real profound truth and beauty, but they prefer to just bypass the integration work and excuse themselves from it on the basis that, well, I'm already God, and so are you, so nothing needs to be done. But that divinity doesn't flow through all our words and actions unless we do the integration work. Even though it's true that we're already divine, etc., ultimately that doesn't benefit other beings if you're not willing to do the integration work. So that's an important thing. That this whole discourse around enlightenment, when we clear it up, again, there's very practical implications to using more correct terminology like awakening and then integration and then liberation, as opposed to enlightenment, where it's all just kind of downloaded magically into someone's brain. And if you believe that, then you might be willing to follow a guru you think is enlightened, and then later discover that their conduct is not impeccable, because maybe their awakening is real, but their integration is incomplete. But if you have the correct teachings and the correct translations, you would already be aware of that, as a possibility that this person can be awake and yet not fully integrated. And that's a valid, thing that to be aware of,
So when I hear the word liberation, it still makes me kind of think of the idea of enlightenment that you hear in a lot of traditions, which is this idea of the burning up of karmic residues in such a way that you kind of skyrocket out of the world. But from what I understand, this is not the tantric teaching, that you're not transcending existence, correct? Like liberation is something imminent.
Right. For some schools of thought, it is transcendent, but for the tantric schools that I study, also known as Kaula schools, they stress liberation in the body, and that means not burning all the karma and all the samskaras so that you transcend and get out of the, you go beyond Earth's gravitational pull, as it were.
Yeah.
Here you actually are not expected to dissolve all your samskaras. That means impressions of past experiences. Mm-hmm. You're not expected to end all your karma, because then nothing would bind you to other human beings and human relationships, which are valued in this tradition. So you're not expected to do anything, but you're encouraged, if you want this integrated, liberated state, you're encouraged to dissolve as much of this psychological baggage, these samskaras and so on, as necessary to no longer get hijacked by those impressions and the triggered emotions that are associated with them. Meaning, when you have unresolved emotional experiences in your being from your past, you get triggered, and then you say brutal things to other people, or you behave in ways that you later regret. Mm-hmm. So if you do the work necessary so that you still have, a psychology to some extent, you still have some samskaras to some extent, but they no longer control you, they no longer hijack you, mm-hmm. And you're free. In that sense, liberation just means you're free to consciously choose the most beneficial course of action, instead of getting hijacked by your fear, your anger, your insecurity, your jealousy, and so on. And none of those emotions are even bad. The tradition does not say that these emotions are bad. They just say, if you get hijacked by them, then you do something that in retrospect you feel was not aligned with your deepest values. That's not liberation, by definition. Mm-hmm.
So yes, it does. But I have a further question, or a follow-up question, which is, so following liberation, do you continue to reincarnate? In other traditions, after you've reached liberation or enlightenment, you no longer reincarnate, which always to me sounded like a real bummer, because I was like, well, reincarnation sounds fun, so why would I want to end it? That doesn't sound like a great.
Except. For most human beings in the history of the world, embodied existence is dominated by suffering. Right. If we're extremely lucky, and it's important to remember that
we are,
that we are, and that the teachings about getting out of the reincarnation cycle are contextualized in cultural environments in which embodiment for most people is suffering, and still is for so many people around the world, indeed the majority. So just on terms of a purely physical level, let alone spiritual angst, which I think afflicts everyone who hasn't made progress on the spiritual path. So the thing is, the tantric tradition, however, is not that interested in that particular question. It's because they do not preach awakening and liberation as a way out of the reincarnation cycle. They preach it as a way to become intimate with reality, free of your cultural conditioning, more awake, more alive, more engaged, more real, more full of love. And it's a state that benefits all other beings, and they're not very interested in the whole escape from reincarnation part. They don't talk about it much. Okay. It's there in the cultural background. It's just not a central value in tantric culture per se. And of course, there is the notion, especially in tantric Buddhism, of reincarnating in order to benefit other beings, the Dalai Lama being the most obvious example. The current Dalai Lama is considered a reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama, etc. And this makes no philosophical sense if it's the same soul. If it's the same soul reincarnating, how could that be? Because if the Dalai Lama is self-realized or awakened, by definition, there is no separate being
Exactly.
to reincarnate. So what reincarnates in the tradition has an answer. Yeah. What reincarnates is the intention to benefit all beings, specifically the Avalokiteshvara vow, the Bodhisattva vow, is what's reincarnating, not a person.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's an interesting teaching, and it shows that the tradition has this idea that, you know, this intent to benefit other beings can sort of reincarnate, even though there's no, you know, if you are truly self-realized, there's no separate Jacob, right? If the you know, prior to awakening, Jacob is like a drop of water in a test tube. Post full awakening, or Jacob is merged with the ocean of consciousness, the ocean of being. Mm-hmm. How are you going to pick out that drop again?
Right.
You know, you're not. But that doesn't matter, because you literally are everything. You actually, you know, experience yourself in everything, and therefore death has no fear. And of course, life energy continues in another form, but it's not a continuation of the same being, because that being has become the whole, has become the universe.
It's not like an autonomous unit that's, you know, rising out of a body and then planting itself into another one.
Right.
I really love that idea of the intention to help all beings reincarnating. I've never heard anyone express it that way, and I think it's so beautiful and such a fruitful way to think about it, compared to kind of this, you know, monadic soul that we're kind of, you know, talking about. So now I want to shift gears as we get towards the end of our interview, and talk about a recent article that you wrote in response to Lauren Roche's, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Roche?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Lauren Roche's highly popular book, in fact, I have it myself, The Radiance Sutras, which is a quote-unquote translation of the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. And you were not so happy with this translation for a number of reasons. And so I guess I want you to, you know, talk a little bit about the issues with that text, and then just the kind of the general problem that you see in appropriating ancient manuscripts in this kind of poetic way that takes a lot of artistic liberties.
Yeah, and you know, it's easy to misunderstand that article, even though I put a lot of work into making it less misunderstandable. It's still easy to misunderstand it, because my problem is not with Lauren Roche particularly. My problem is with the enterprise that he represents and is a good example of, partially because it's such a popular book. So the thing is, the public is not yet very educated about what constitutes a translation, what constitutes an interpretation, how to discern the difference, how to use them in the different appropriate ways. And what we have in the case of the Radiance Sutras is a poetic rendering, an attempt at a poetic rendering of a primary source in Sanskrit called the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which is a very important scripture in the lineage that I especially study. And the thing is that since we don't have any really good translations of the primary source, the public has no way to discern what in the Radiance Sutras are Lauren's poetic flights of fancy and what are ideas from an ancient text on the yoga of spiritual liberation. So that's the problem, you see. I have no problem with Lauren writing poems inspired by the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. I have a problem with the fact that the reader is not given the tools to discern the difference between Lauren's original authorial poetic voice and the actual teachings of the original scripture. And as it turns out, a close study reveals that very few of the precise yogic teachings of the original scripture make it into the Radiance Sutras. Certainly some do. and the value in the Radiant Sutras largely comes from Lauren's own experience as a meditator, and the beauty of the poems comes from his skill as a poet. I don't think all the poems are beautiful, but certainly some of them are. Some of them are, and that's his skill as a poet. But for somebody seeking a technology of awakening and liberation, which stood the test of time and was carefully studied and passed down for hundreds and hundreds of years, that book is not giving them access to that. But the problem is they think it is. Most people think the Radiant Sutras is giving them access to this spiritual technology in some measure, in some significant measure. And so it's a missed opportunity because people don't realize what they're missing because they're not equipped to realize what they're missing. And it just so happens that the original text is, I think, extremely powerful. It offers extremely effective technologies, spiritual technologies. And we only, as far as I'm concerned, we as a culture, including Lauren and me in the same culture, we have no business creating a poetic rendering of a text that hasn't even been translated correctly yet.
Yeah.
And once we have that, then we're in a different situation. And that's why I have no problem with Matthew Remsky's poetic and modern rephrasing of the Yoga Sutra, because we already have many accurate translations of the Yoga Sutra, and they're there for people to consult. And so Remsky's not leading people astray, whereas with this Radiant Sutras, we don't have something for people to compare it to. I mean, we do have other translations of the Vijnana Bhairava, but none of them are quite correct, and many of them miss the point in terms of the text seeks to give you practices that you can actually do and experience a profound effect from. So if you get the details wrong, I mean, in this case, God is in the details when it comes to this text. If you get the details wrong, we're talking about very subtle awareness cultivation techniques. If you get the details wrong, the practice can't give its fruit. It can't confer its benefit. And so there is benefit to reading the Radiant Sutras, but very little of that benefit derives from the text, the original Sanskrit text that the Radiant Sutras purports to be a transmission of, or a translation of, or an interpretation of, and he's never quite clear about that. So, as for those who wish to be informed yogis, these things matter, and it matter. I think it matters both culturally and spiritually. And so, that's why, and a lot of yogis, especially Californian yogis, they don't like hearing critical comments about someone else's teaching. And I have held on to those comments for the past 4 years, and I tried to reach out to Lauren directly and got no response. I communicated with his editor at Sounds True back and forth, who understood some of the issues, to no avail. Eventually, the editor at Sounds True actually promised me in email that the book would be clearly marked, clearly explained to be not a translation at all in any way, and that didn't end up happening because so Lauren, I think because Lauren believes it is just as valid as a translation, and the reason he believes that is because he doesn't understand Sanskrit. So anyway, it's a long story. Read the article.
Yeah, no, it's a great article. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great article, and it definitely. I've talked to a couple of people who probably responded in a similar way to some of your California yogis in not being able to like tease out the point that you're making from kind of a personal smear. But I feel like what is at stake, and tell me if you perhaps agree, is the different what you said about technologies of awakening. I feel like in general, in, I don't want to say Western spirituality, that sounds very general, but at least in the United States, in the yoga community, there's a sense of not so much an appeal to spirituality as a technology. We're kind of in this milieu of spirituality as kind of a salad bar, sort of, choose your own adventure kind of experience that really is at the hands of one's own kind of personal fantasy creation, and so the idea of a science of awakening, I think, is actually very alien to a lot of people. So I'm wondering if you could maybe, if you agree with that, if you could say a few words on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, and I'm glad we're going over time because these are very important points that are fundamentally misunderstood. I mean, my teachers, my academic teachers, served a very important purpose because they taught me to ask the question, when you look at these ancient texts and teachings, what do they assume that the audience already knows and therefore they don't even have to mention? And so fundamental presuppositions are different in this modern Western yoga culture and the ancient culture of these sources. Fundamental presuppositions are different. And one of the best examples you just raised, which is that modern yoga practitioners and spiritual practitioners generally are often oriented to experience, having beautiful experiences, mystical experiences, revelatory experiences, whereas the original tradition is oriented not so much to experience, but to accomplishing a fundamental and permanent paradigm shift, of which experience is only a byproduct, Right. So that fundamental orientation is so crucial and accounts for the very different results we're seeing. People in the West who do yoga are having lovely experiences, but rarely are experiencing undergoing the fundamental paradigm shift in which, as the tradition says, you see the truth, the wordless underlying truth of reality so clearly that you can't unsee it again. And you enter into a different paradigm and from, permanently. That's what the tradition's interested in, a change in your default state of being and your default state as opposed to how high you get experientially.
Right.
They're interested in changing the default state, the state that you come back down to when the experience, whatever it is done. Mm-hmm. And so that is a crucial thing to contemplate as a yogi, is like, what am I actually doing here? Am I oriented to experience, or am I oriented to a fundamental paradigm shift or shift in my default state? That is harder to accomplish, but ultimately, I think, far more fulfilling than any number of blissful experiences.
Yeah. And I in fact, you mentioning blissful experience, it makes me recall something that you had said in your talk in Brooklyn, which is the idea of Ananda. The idea of Ananda it should not be confused with kind of these, momentary highs. That's not what we're talking about. You mentioned how Ananda is actually something that persists even when pleasurable and unpleasurable experiences are taking place. Is that correct?
Yes, that's more, yes, but the tradition actually articulates different kinds of Ananda, but the deepest, in the 7 kinds of Ananda, but the deepest kind of Ananda is the quiet but deep contentment with what is, the love for the whole of reality that persists even in experiences of grief, sadness, longing, sorrow, that there's a bliss, a subtle but very strong kind of bliss, which is simply the joy of being alive, which it's possible to access so deeply that joy of simply being alive and being aware doesn't go away, even in very painful experiences. So it's the bliss of accepting the coming and going of all that comes and goes. Not only accepting, almost rejoicing in, sort of quietly rejoicing in the coming and going of all that comes and goes. That's very different from the kind of bliss that comes and goes.
Right. Yeah. Well, that sounds like a beautiful place to be. I hope I get there someday.
And also, I can't let you end it there, because to imagine it as, as a future state is
Exactly.
spiritually problematic. We just want to acknowledge, okay, this state already exists within me.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to deepen my experience of my own being to where I can access that already true thing,
Right.
within me. So it's not a state to someday get to, but if I can deepen, starting now, if I can deepen into the now, deepen into my experience of my own being, more and more I taste that which is already true, my capacity to be in love with reality as it is.
Okay, that's a beautiful place to end it. All right, thank you so much, Christopher. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.